He was a good man. He was a good brother. He was a good dad. He didn't deserve what happened to him.
He'd been shot 8 times. One of his shoes had actually come off of him when he fell on the stairs. There was blood everywhere, and he was actually still alive.
They hunted him down like an animal, and they really wanted him dead.
They were heartless. It's like they didn't even care.
He wanted to retaliate back on my brother when he saw him again, and that's what happened. The young man wanted to get some payback.
June 11th, 2016, Atlanta, Georgia. At 3:17 a.m., DeKalb County police and paramedics respond to a shooting at an apartment complex known as the Hamps.
Atlanta is, like a lot of big cities, violent. That's just the facts. In this particular community, that was even more intense because it's a lower income community, and violence, gangs, drug dealing were a part of daily life.
When they arrived, they found a man who had been shot approximately 8 times and was barely still alive. There was blood everywhere.
Authorities need to protect the crime scene.
You're gonna have witnesses or just bystanders coming out of the woodwork to stand around. So the police had to secure the area and keep people from coming in and disturbing evidence.
As first responders rushed the victim to the hospital, police tried to identify him. Luckily, some of the bystanders recognized the victim from the neighborhood.
The victim was identified as Timothy Hobbs.
Timothy Hobbs was born in 1978 in a small town near Atlanta.
We grew up in Monticello, Georgia, a little country town. Everybody knows everybody.
Life in rural Georgia was peaceful and taught Timothy the importance of family.
Timothy was goofy, silly, fun to be around. Everything that a little sister can want in a big brother. We loved each other, and we were close, very close.
It's like a gentle, big teddy bear. You know, real kind-hearted, very protective of his family.
He was a good person. I mean, he would give you the shirt off of his back.
Timothy wanted nothing more than to have a family of his own, and he got a chance in his late 20s when he moved to Atlanta and met a single mother named Rhonda.
When Timothy met Rhonda, he fell deeply in love.
Rhonda had a daughter from a previous relationship, and it wasn't a problem for Timothy because he treated her like it was his own. For someone who couldn't wait to be a dad, it was the perfect situation. He was able to step in and be there for that little girl.
Then, in 2008, Timothy and Rhonda added a child of their own.
Timothy was an amazing father. He loved his little girl. He absolutely adored her. Everything that he did was for his little girl. Everything. In every way. I mean, if she calls and say, "Daddy, I need this," or "Daddy, can you come?" He was there. Every time. No hesitation. That was his baby.
Every time I talked to him, he was always talking about his daughter. He did anything he could to be there for her, and whatever, it was birthdays or whatever, he was always making sure she had the best party and everybody showed up.
That was what he was known for. That was how he was received by everyone that knew him as a proud father.
But as dedicated as they were to their children, Timothy and Rhonda's relationship had its ups and downs. For several years, they decided to live under separate roofs. Rhonda and the girls stayed in an apartment in the Hams, while Timothy lived with family members.
He took care of my grandmother and my grandfather. He was staying with them, and he was making sure they was all right.
Whatever he could do or whatever they needed, he was there to help take care of them. Doctor's appointment, cutting grass, cooking, everything he could do, he done it.
Not only was he a father, but he also took care of his grandparents. So he really operated intergenerationally, trying to take care of people in his life that he loved.
When Timothy wasn't spending time with his daughters, he worked countless hours to provide for them.
He worked hard for a living. He worked both in manufacturing as well as in setting up concerts.
Timothy worked in production, helped setting up shows and different things for people that had different venues they were doing, and he worked helping set up things and stuff like that.
Timothy, he loved what he did in production. He had a passion for it. He was very passionate about what he did, and he did it well.
Then in 2016, 8 years after Timothy and Rhonda's daughter was born, they decided it was time to make a permanent commitment to their relationship.
Mr. Hobbs was engaged to the mother of his child, and he was in love and took care of them, nurtured them, had a loving relationship with them, and they intended on getting married.
Timothy, he was trying to do the right thing for his little girl. He wanted to be with the mother of his child. He wanted to be one happy family. He just wanted to be under the same roof as his little girl. Want to be there with her at all times.
But now those plans are in jeopardy. Timothy has been found shot several times, and his loved ones are just waking up to hear the news.
I got a call from my oldest brother. I was getting ready to go to work, so it was probably about 4, 5 o'clock in the morning. He told me that my brother had been shot. So me and my mom got up and went to Atlanta and met my brother there.
They were operating on him at the time, but we couldn't see him. My thoughts were always, maybe he just got shot in the arm or something. Didn't know how serious it was. We just waited. A few other family members came in, just praying and believing that everything would be okay.
As the family prays for Timothy's recovery, police begin searching the crime scene for clues.
It was a gruesome scene. There were bullet casings everywhere. There was blood down the stairwell. There was a shoe that seemed as if it belonged to Timothy Hobbs.
The shell casings recovered were .40 caliber shell casings. It's not that distinctive. It's fairly common.
Given the location of the body and the shell casings, investigators believe the shooter fired at Timothy from the bottom of the stairs while he was walking up.
This was a man that was shot in the back 8 times. Someone wanted him dead. Someone intended to kill him.
While surgeons at Atlanta's Grady Memorial Hospital operate on 37-year-old Timothy Hobbs, DeKalb County investigators try to determine who shot him and why. It does not appear that he lives in the apartment building where he was found, known as the Hams.
But he didn't have keys to an apartment in that building.
Though the neighbors recognize him, none seem willing to cooperate with police.
In a lot of communities and in a lot of apartment complexes, people are reluctant to talk because they live there and they don't want any retribution. And in this case, it was very much the same.
A lot of people didn't want to get into it. So you know how it is. I saw something, but I'm gonna close my eyes because it's not my business or whatnot.
Most apartment buildings have security cameras, so the first thing they want to do is look at the tapes.
The building's management can't retrieve the footage over the weekend, so detectives will have to wait to review the recordings. They head to the hospital to check on Timothy and his family, where terrible news awaits.
I knew something was going on when they came in and they took their hats off. Normally when you see stuff on TV, they're about to deliver some news that you don't want to hear.
While Mr. Hobbs was at the hospital, he actually redlined once, and the doctors were able to bring him back. But there was too much damage, too much blood loss, and he finally passed away.
I just screamed. Because that was my big brother. Someone had taken away from me. That's all I could do. I couldn't do nothing but scream. My brother was gone. And for what reason, I don't know. I just knew he was gone. And wasn't coming back. I was hurt.
Like, that was my little brother. You know, I'm big brother, so, you know, I always tried to protect my brother. But I couldn't protect him that night. You know, that always bothered me.
Despite their grief, Timothy's loved ones want to help in the investigation. They tell police he stays in the apartment building across the street with his fiancée, Rhonda. And they say he recently got into a fight in the neighborhood.
My brother, we had a conversation about 2 weeks before he passed, and he mentioned to me that he got into the altercation with someone, and he told me he got the best of him. You know, I don't know what brought on the altercation or whatnot personally, but I'm assuming that because my brother said he got the best of him, that the young man wanted to get some payback.
The family explains that Rhonda thinks the other man is responsible for Timothy's death, and she knows his first name, Derek.
I've never heard the name Derek until after this happened. So only information I got is that he was the one that shot my brother.
I didn't know him. I mean, my brother never talked about him.
But when investigators go to the apartment to talk to Rhonda, she isn't there.
That strikes police as a little strange. She's not at home, and she's not at the hospital. She could be laying low with the kids, but to an investigator, it's a red flag.
On Monday, June 13th, investigators meet with the apartment manager, who provides the surveillance footage from the night Timothy was shot. They quickly find what they're looking for.
There was a video of an individual who approached Mr. Hobbs prior to Mr. Hobbs being shot to death.
On the surveillance video, I saw my brother going across the parking lot, walking to another apartment, and shortly after you see another guy walking.
On the video, you can see the guy is holding something in his hand as he goes inside the stairwell.
It looked as if you could actually see the gun in his hand.
He hid behind the back of an apartment by a stairwell until my brother came out of the apartment.
Then, a series of gunshots ring out. Timothy calls out for help. And he yells a name. The shooter doesn't appear on camera again, but after the last shots are fired, a third man runs across the parking lot and into the stairwell.
Hey! Hey! What up, man? Here, God!
You can tell from the emotion in this guy's voice that he knows Timothy.
Here! Oh, man! What up, man?
He's in shock and he doesn't know what to do.
Hell, God! Here, now!
It's not clear who the third man is, but based on the video evidence, the building manager is able to identify exactly who the shooter is.
The individual who is seen walking in the area where Mr. Hobbs was shot had a very distinct walk, described by some as kind of hunched over, kind of pigeon-toed. That person is identified as Derek Thurman.
It's the same name they got from Timothy's family. So they want to know everything they can about this guy.
The manager tells police Derek is a 25-year-old man who lives in the Hams.
He had quite the reputation for fighting and being confrontational.
The manager also says Derek was involved in another incident at the complex 3 months earlier.
We became aware that Mr. Thurman was shot during a shootout.
Two days after Timothy Hobbs was shot to death at an apartment building in East Atlanta, investigators have a suspect, 25-year-old Derek Thurman. And according to the property manager, it isn't the first time Derek has been involved in a shooting.
On March 13, 2016, Mr. Thurman was involved in an altercation. Shots were fired.
Derek was outside in the complex when a shootout broke out. He was hit multiple times in his leg and in his stomach.
He was wounded and other people were wounded as well. It's that level of violence where someone could be attacked, violently attacked during the day, in broad daylight.
Derek's injuries were so bad that he spent over a month in the hospital, and eventually they put a colostomy bag in.
In addition to the colostomy bag, the damage to his leg gave him a distinct limp.
Word on the street was that Derek has been looking for revenge ever since.
At this point, Derek has a colostomy bag, and not only is he bitter, he is angry at this person who shot him. He was big mad. Somebody had to pay.
Investigators go to Derek's apartment to question him, but he's not there. The next day, however, they do catch up with Timothy's fiancée, Rhonda.
She shows up at the apartment after a couple of days with their girls. Right away, it's clear that she didn't have anything to do with Timothy's death.
Rhonda tells police Timothy left the apartment around 12:30 a.m. the night of the shooting.
Timothy had a couple of friends in the complex that he hung out with, and that's what he told Rhonda he was doing when he went out.
She isn't sure which friend it was, but says it might have been a man named Chenard, who actually lives in a nearby building in the Hams.
That name immediately rings a bell, because they heard that name on a security video. Chenard's apartment is near the stairs where Timothy was shot. Rhonda says there's talk in the building that Timothy was visiting Chenard when the shooting happened.
Rhonda says there was definitely bad blood between Timothy and Derek.
Mr. Thurman was actually dating or seeing Rhonda's younger sister. When the police spoke with Mr. Hobbs' fiancee, they learned that Mr. Hobbs and Mr. Thurman had actually had an altercation just weeks earlier.
Mr. Thurman attacked him along with some other men and beat him to the point that he was bleeding.
Timothy held his own, and he won that fight.
Based on the timing, this is probably the same fight that Timothy told his brother about.
Rhonda can't remember why they were fighting, but according to her, Timothy couldn't have been the person who shot Derek.
Mr. Hobbs didn't own a gun, wasn't involved in any violent acts, wasn't involved in any kind of gang or drug activity, was a working man and a father.
The only reason he was at those apartments was because his daughter was there. But even though the apartments were bad, many times I was with my brother, he never had a weapon or anything that he felt he needed to protect himself with. It wasn't the person to go around starting anything.
The family and everyone associated with the family, they don't believe at all that he had anything to do with Mr. Thurman being shot. In fact, when Mr. Thurman was shot, Mr. Hobbs wasn't even out at the Hamps during that time.
When investigators show Rhonda the security footage, she's able to give them another key piece of information: the name of the third man captured on video.
This is the guy that runs in after the last shot is fired to try to help Timothy. According to Rhonda, this is one of his good friends, Big John. So that's a great lead, because if anyone saw where Derek ran off to, it's probably him.
Steve, how did you go? Steve.
After speaking to Timothy Hobbs' fiancée, Rhonda, detectives have another lead to follow. A man known as Big John, who came to Timothy's aid after the shooting.
Steve, go ahead. Steve.
So police are talking to Big John, and he tells him that he and Timothy were hanging out like they usually do on the weekends.
So about 3 a.m., Mr. Hobbs decides he wants a beer before he turns in for the night. So not having any, like a lot of these neighborhoods, they have the local bootlegger, or what we used to call a candy man, person that sells anything you want. So he goes to the bootlegger to get his beer.
Big John says Timothy was only gone for a few minutes when he heard the gunshots.
He immediately runs over there without a second thought. But by the time he gets to Timothy, the shooter is already gone. He calls for help and tries to keep Timothy awake until police get there. He can tell from all the blood that his friend is in seriously bad shape.
He doesn't know if the gunman was Derek Thurman, but says Timothy did mention running into him earlier that day.
Timothy told Big John that he walked past Derek at the complex, and he was mean mugging him. That means Derek was already at the scene. So the question is, what happened between those two? The next person that the investigators want to talk to is the bootlegger. He is probably the last person to see Timothy before the shooting.
When police get the name of the bootlegger, another piece of the puzzle falls into place.
It's Chenard, the last guy Timothy called out to on the surveillance recording. So why is he just calling for help? Does he think Chenard set him up?
When police find Chenard, he agrees to tell them what he knows.
He seemed anxious to clear his name, but he also didn't want to be seen talking to cops. He immediately said he had nothing to do with Timothy's death.
According to Chenard, Timothy knocked on his door around 3:15 a.m.
He remembers selling him the beer, a six-pack, him leaving. His shortly thereafter, hearing shots.
He has no idea who's doing the shooting or who's being shot. His first instinct is to go and lock his door. Then he hears Timothy calling his name.
He comes out, he looks down, and he can see Mr. Hobbs sprawled out on the stairs, but he was breathing. He was alive. And so he called 911.
Unfortunately, Chenard says he didn't see who the shooter was either, but he must have been hiding in the stairwell, waiting for Timothy to come out.
Whoever shot Timothy was obviously lurking in the shadows. They were plotting and planning. They hunted him down like an animal, and they really wanted him dead.
Even without an eyewitness, Derek Thurman appears to be the only suspect. And his motive is confirmed once detectives find the report about his own shooting in March.
They'd investigated the shooting of Mr. Thurman about several months before Mr. Hobbs' death. And this detective says that Mr. Hobbs' name came up as a potential suspect.
And the anonymous tip must have made its way back to Derek.
I think he had to have thought that Hobbs either was the one that shot him or he had something to do with it. So he's had all this time to think about payback.
But detectives completely refute any notion that he was involved in shooting Mr. Thurman before that or anyone else.
But Timothy's name isn't the only thing in the report about the earlier shootout that catches their attention.
The report lists two different casings, a .380 and .40 caliber handgun. The .380 was used to shoot Derek. The .40 was used to shoot back.
That was significant as well, that the connection during the shootout where Mr. Thurman was shot and the actual shooting of Mr. Hobbs was that these .40 caliber shell casings were found at both crime scenes.
So they get the crime lab to rush the analysis on both sets of the bullets. Because if they match, they know that Derek's gun was the one that killed Timothy.
Atlanta police are looking for 25-year-old Derek Thurman, suspected of murdering Timothy Hobbs in retaliation for an earlier shooting police don't think Timothy was responsible for. As detectives canvass the neighborhood for leads, they come across an associate of Derek's named Andre.
Andre doesn't want to say anything to police, especially not about Derek, but they eventually get him to talk.
He was out with Derek Thurman that night, those early morning hours of June the 11th in 2016.
Mr. Thurman was known to hang out in the breezeway all day, all night, drinking, as he did the night of the homicide.
At the same time, Timothy was on his beer run to Chenard's. Andre says at one point Derek told him, "I'll be right back." And as he walked away, Andre heard him mutter something under his breath.
He said, "There's that mother."
Andre didn't know who Derek was talking about, but under the circumstances, it seems pretty likely he spotted Timothy.
Andre says after Derek left, he decided to head back to his apartment.
And shortly thereafter, gunshots are heard. That is significant circumstantial evidence that Mr. Thurman is going after Mr. Hobbs.
Mr. Thurman was known to carry a .40 caliber pistol with him in the neighborhood. Matter of fact, the night of the homicide, Mr. Thurman had a .40 caliber pistol.
Andre claims he doesn't know anything about the shooting, but when investigators press him, he admits Derek had it out for Timothy. And Andre knows more about the earlier altercation between the two.
The story goes that Timothy bought some drugs from a man named Little Ham, and someone stole those drugs from Timothy. He thought it was Little Ham running some sort of hustle and he confronted him. So Derek was friends with this guy, Little Ham, and didn't like that. So Derek confronted Timothy.
Not long after that fight, Derek got shot.
At this point, Derek has a colostomy bag. He is angry. He wants to seek payback for whoever did this to him.
Jump to the night of the shooting. He's out drinking with his buddy and sees Timothy walking into that stairwell alone. He's never gonna get a better shot.
When investigators get the results of the ballistics tests on the casings from the shootout where Derek was injured and those from Timothy's murder, their theory is confirmed.
Those shell casings, crime lab has put those together and those shell casings match, meaning they came from the same weapon.
It looked like a clear-cut revenge killing. But the tragic thing is, he probably got the wrong guy. It was never any proof that Timothy was the one who shot Derek.
Mr. Hobbs' family is really clear that he was not involved in any violence. He didn't have any history of violence. The night that he was shot, he didn't have a gun on him.
Investigators now have enough evidence to arrest Derek Thurman. There's only one problem. They still can't find him.
He was doing his very best to elude capture. So detectives, fugitive squads are looking for Mr. Thurman. They're looking for months.
So it was encouraging to know that they still looking for the guy, but no one knew where he was.
The more time that goes by, the more chances they have to hide, the further away they can get from you, the more of the time they have to cover their tracks.
It was just me waiting on the date for somebody to call and said they got somebody. I mean, months just passing by, not knowing where he was or if he was coming after us. I mean, it was scary because we didn't know what his next move was gonna be. We didn't know. It was just scary.
It was a living hell for the family. Because they didn't know what he was going to do. They did not want anyone coming to try to take them out because of their relationship to Mr. Hobbs. And so it was just a time of fear.
Then on November 16th, 5 months after Timothy's murder, Derek finally turns up.
The police eventually catch up with Derek, who is in North Dakota. He had gotten there by a Greyhound bus, which takes approximately 24 hours from Atlanta to North Dakota.
He apparently went to a hospital in Bismarck, and while he was there, he dropped his ID card. When it was found, police ran his name and discovered he was wanted for murder. They were able to find the address where he was staying and arrested him without incident.
Derek informed the police that he was not on the run. He was there to seek medical attention for his colostomy bag. I don't know about you, but I don't know of anyone who would ride on a Greyhound bus to seek medical attention.
On December 2nd, Derek Thurman is extradited back to DeKalb County to face trial.
You would think the case would be open and shut, but most of what they had was circumstantial. They can put him at the scene, but they can't prove that he pulled the trigger.
On October 9th, 2017, Derek Thurman's trial gets underway. He's charged with the murder of 37-year-old Timothy Hobbs.
So many shootings happen in this area on a daily basis that there was barely any media coverage.
It was a few people that he knew that was there, maybe like 2 or 3. It wasn't packed at all. It was us, the jurors, and a few people on his side, and me and my mother and my cousin. The first day when he came in the courtroom, he looked and turned his head. Because we were right there when he came in. And he knew that we were Timothy's family. And he never looked at us again.
Prosecutors build their case against Derek using eyewitness accounts of his previous fight with Timothy, along with ballistics analysis and security footage from the apartments.
There's video of Mr. Thurman walking through the breezeway following Mr. Hobbs. The prosecutor blew up the video and you could actually see the gun in his hand too.
There were a number of people who testified, including Mr. Hobbs' fiance and her daughter, about recognizing Mr. Thurman as the person in the video.
From him walking in the courtroom and the walk that was on the surveillance, it was the same. Same walk, same little limp that he had. That particular night, he knew he was there, and he waited. And when he seen my brother, he hid. And he shot him.
Shot him multiple times. Then as he tried to run, he continued to shoot him. Dying in a way that he did is heartbreaking.
But Derek's attorneys insist he's not the man on the video, and he had nothing to do with Timothy's death.
The defense maintains that just because Derek has locks and he has the same build doesn't mean he is the person from the surveillance video. There are lots of people in the complex that could fit that description as well. Derek claimed he was in a lot of pain and he was physically incapable of shooting Timothy Hobbs.
Part of his defense claim was he couldn't have done the shooting because he was incapacitated. He couldn't move around. Well, that's not the case with colostomy bag. People work and move around daily with them. It's not incapacitated.
When Derek takes the stand, he says the prosecution's claims about him wanting revenge are wrong because he knew Timothy wasn't the one who shot him.
No one knew if Derek truly believed that, or if he was just trying to distance himself from Timothy's murder by eliminating a motive.
So if you knew he didn't shoot you, why did you shoot him? Why did you shoot my brother? If you knew that he didn't shoot you at the time that you got shot, why? What reason?
The trial only lasts for 3 days. On October 12, 2017, the jury gives their verdict.
Derek Thurman was found guilty, sentenced to life in prison.
I knew he was guilty because I seen him. I knew it was him on the surveillance. It was very cowardly to hide and shoot him from behind. If you have a problem with someone and, if it's resulting to that, why would you hide and shoot him?
It was a sense of wellness over me. I was happy that, he didn't get off for it. He was found guilty. But it still doesn't get rid of the hurt of losing my brother. But at the same sense, to give you some kind of sense of relief that justice was served.
Timothy was a light in his community, and it's such a tragedy his life had to end this way.
The death of Timothy Hobbs has to matter. it mattered.
There are moments in a criminal investigation when a single sentence can change everything. A sentence that sounds ordinary at first. A sentence spoken by a frightened parent, perhaps with a trembling voice, perhaps through tears, perhaps while surrounded by strangers who have gathered to help. My daughter is missing. On the evening of January 27th, 2008, in the small Nova Scotian community of Bridgewater, those words began a search that would grip an entire town. A 12-year-old girl named Carissa Boudreau was gone. She had disappeared after being with her mother, Penny Boudreau. And in the hours that followed, the story appeared painfully simple. A child had vanished. A mother was desperate to find her. The community needed to act quickly. The police needed information. Every passing minute mattered. But there was something the people searching for Carissa did not know. Something the cameras did not know. Something the neighbors did not know. And at first, something even the investigators could not fully see. The person standing at the center of the search was not simply the mother of a missing child. She was the last person known to have been with Carissa. And according to what investigators would eventually uncover, Penny already knew that her daughter was not missing at all. Carissa was dead. Her body was somewhere in the landscape surrounding Bridgewater, and the woman asking people to help bring her home already knew that there was no home left to return to. That is where the story begins. Not with a body. Not with an arrest. Not with a confession. It begins with a mother telling the world that her daughter has disappeared. And for the people who heard her, the words must have sounded like a nightmare any parent could understand. Because 12 years old is an age when a child still belongs partly to the world of childhood. A school bag by the door. A bedroom that is never perfectly tidy. A favorite shirt. A voice calling from another room. The small routines that make a person feel permanent. At 12, a child can still be young enough to need a parent and old enough to begin imagining the person she might become. Carissa Boudreau never got to discover who that person would be. On that January night, the future that should have stretched in front of her was suddenly reduced to a few hours, a few roads, a few decisions, and a terrible secret. Bridgewater in winter is not a place that easily gives up its secrets. Nova Scotia in January can be unforgiving. The daylight disappears early. The cold settles over roads and fields. Trees stand dark against the winter sky. The landscape can feel vast even when you are only a short distance from town. And when someone disappears in such a place, every hour matters. The first hours of a missing person investigation are filled with motion. Police vehicles, questions, telephone calls, neighbors stepping outside, people looking down roads and into ditches, someone remembering a vehicle they saw earlier, someone else wondering whether a child might have been frightened, confused, injured, or taken. The mind begins creating possibilities faster than the investigators can eliminate them. Perhaps she wandered away. Perhaps she met someone. Perhaps someone followed her. Perhaps she was abducted. Perhaps she was still alive somewhere, waiting to be found. And while those possibilities multiplied, one person possessed a piece of information that could have ended the uncertainty. Penny Boudreau knew what had happened to Carissa. Yet the search continued. The town searched for a missing child while the truth remained hidden. This is what makes the opening of the Carissa Boudreau case so deeply disturbing. It was not simply a murder. It was the construction of a false reality. A reality in which Carissa was still somewhere out there. A reality in which her mother was waiting for her. A reality in which strangers were encouraged to hope. And hope is powerful. When a child disappears, hope can turn ordinary people into searchers. They walk through places they have never walked before. They check wooded areas. They look beside roads. They study photographs. They share information. They imagine the child's face. They imagine the family waiting at home. They imagine what it would feel like if the missing child were their own. Carissa's disappearance became more than a private family tragedy. It became a community crisis. And at the center of it was Penny, the mother. The person who should have been searching hardest. The person who should have been demanding answers. the person who should have been unable to sleep until her daughter was found. Instead, according to the evidence that emerged later, Penny was living inside a terrible contradiction. She had to perform grief while carrying knowledge that grief could not explain. She had to speak about a missing child while knowing the child would never answer. She had to allow other people to search for Carissa without revealing where the search should really have been directed. And every time someone asked where Carissa might be, Penny had to protect the lie. That distinction is important because the most frightening part of deception is not always the first lie. It is what happens afterward. One lie creates another. One invented detail needs another invented detail to support it. A false timeline needs an explanation. A suspicious gap needs a reason. A question needs an answer. And eventually, the person telling the lie can find themselves trapped inside a story that has to be constantly maintained. But in the beginning, none of that was visible. There was only a missing 12-year-old girl and a mother who said she wanted her back. Carissa had been with Penny earlier that day. That fact would become one of the most important pieces of the investigation. The last known movements of a missing person are always examined carefully. Who saw them? Where did they go? What time did they leave? What did they say? What did they carry? Who were they with? What vehicle did they enter? What route did they take? What should have happened next? In Carissa's case, those questions pointed toward the person who was supposed to be her protector, her mother. The relationship between a mother and daughter is often imagined as something instinctive and unbreakable. A mother is supposed to recognize the sound of her child's footsteps, to know the difference between an ordinary silence and a troubling one, to notice when something is wrong, to protect, to comfort, to remain when everyone else leaves. For Carissa, the person who should have represented safety became the center of the investigation. And yet, during those first hours, there was no way for the public to know that. People saw a mother. They saw a child who was missing. They saw a community beginning to mobilize. They did not see the private decisions that had already been made. They did not know that the search itself was becoming part of the deception. The clock moved forward. Night became morning. Morning became another day. And Carissa remained missing. As the days passed, the emotional temperature of the case changed. At first, there is panic, then urgency, then fear, then the terrible possibility that the missing person may not be found alive. For Carissa's family and those who cared about her, every new piece of information carried enormous weight. A possible sighting could bring hope. A strange report could bring fear. An abandoned item could become the center of attention. And somewhere beneath all of this was the question that investigators could not escape. Where was Carissa? The answer was closer than anyone wanted to believe. She was not waiting somewhere for rescuers. She was not lost. She had not simply wandered away. Someone had killed her. And according to the eventual confession and evidence, that person was her own mother. The violence itself is difficult enough to comprehend, but the circumstances surrounding it make the case even more unsettling. Investigators would eventually determine that Penny had taken Carissa to a more isolated area outside Bridgewater. There, the relationship between mother and daughter ended in violence. Penny restrained Carissa. She pressed her down, and she used a cord to strangle her. The physical details are horrifying, but the most painful fact is not contained in the mechanics of the killing. It is contained in the identity of the two people involved. One was 12 years old, the other was her mother. And after Carissa died, the story did not end. That was only the beginning of the deception. Penny returned to the world as though she were still a mother, waiting for her daughter to come home. She reported Carissa missing at approximately 8:35 that evening. From that moment forward, the investigation began moving along a path shaped by information Penny provided. That is one of the central themes of this case. Investigators were not initially chasing the truth. They were chasing the version of the truth they had been given. And that version suggested that a 12-year-old girl had disappeared. When a child is reported missing, investigators naturally begin by treating the case as a crisis. They cannot assume murder. They cannot assume accident. They cannot assume abduction. They have to consider everything. That uncertainty is necessary. It is also dangerous, because the first hours of an investigation are precious, and false information can send investigators looking in the wrong direction. While police and volunteers searched for Carissa, Penny was able to remain inside the role she had created. The grieving mother, the frightened mother, the mother who wanted answers, the mother who wanted her daughter back. To the outside world, that image was devastatingly believable. Why would a mother kill her own daughter? The question itself could make the possibility feel impossible. People often search for evil in strangers. They imagine a predator hiding in the darkness, a dangerous person watching from somewhere nearby, a vehicle slowing down on an unfamiliar road, a stranger following a child. The idea that danger could come from inside the family is much harder for the human mind to accept, and this is precisely why the case would later become so haunting. Carissa did not need to be lured away by a stranger. She was already with someone she knew, someone she trusted, someone whose presence should have made her feel safe. That person was her mother. For nearly 2 weeks, the search continued. And as investigators worked to find Carissa, the community waited. The longer she remained missing, the darker the possibilities became. Then, on February 9th, 2008, the case changed forever. Carissa's body was found in the Conquerall Bank area. The search for a missing girl had become a homicide investigation. The hope that had kept people moving was replaced by grief. And with the discovery of the body came another question. What had happened to Carissa? Investigators examined the scene. Some details appeared to suggest a sexual assault. Her jeans and underwear had been pulled down. At first glance, the scene could point toward a completely different kind of predator, but the evidence did not ultimately support the conclusion that Carissa had been sexually assaulted. That created a new possibility. Perhaps the scene had been manipulated. Perhaps someone had tried to make investigators believe that Carissa had been attacked by a stranger. Perhaps someone wanted the investigation to move away from the people closest to her. And suddenly, the disappearance began to look different. The questions changed. Who had placed Carissa there? Who knew where she was? Who had the opportunity to kill her? Who could explain her movements? Who had a reason to lie? The investigation began closing in on the people around Carissa. One of them was Vernon McCumber, Penny's boyfriend. His name would become part of the investigation, and for a time the possibility had to be considered that he might have known something about the killing. But the closer investigators looked, the more attention began turning toward Penny herself. Not because a mother's grief is automatically suspicious. It is not. Not because facial expressions can prove guilt. They cannot. But because evidence has a way of testing stories. A timeline either fits or it does not. A statement either agrees with physical evidence or it does not. A person's account either survives questioning or begins to fracture. And in the Carissa Boudreaux case, the story Penny had created would eventually begin to collapse. But that collapse would not happen immediately. There would be more questions, more interviews, more suspicion, more uncertainty, and eventually, investigators would use an unusual strategy to get closer to the truth. A strategy involving an undercover officer. A story designed to make Penny believe that someone could help her. Someone who could make the evidence disappear. Someone who could protect her from the consequences. It was a dangerous psychological game. Because investigators were no longer simply asking Penny what happened, they were creating a situation in which she might reveal what she believed only she knew. And when she did, the false story surrounding Carissa's disappearance would begin to unravel. But before that happened, there was a final image that would remain fixed in the minds of those who followed the case. A mother. A missing child. A community searching. And somewhere beneath the cold January landscape of Nova Scotia, a 12-year-old girl who could no longer speak for herself. Carissa would never have the opportunity to explain what happened that night. She could not correct the lies. She could not tell investigators what she had seen. She could not identify the person who killed her. She could not walk into a courtroom. She could not tell the world who she had been beyond the headlines. That is why the story must begin with her. Not with the woman who lied. Not with the investigation. Not with the courtroom. With Carissa. Because before she became the center of a murder investigation, before her name appeared in newspapers and television reports, before people gathered to search for her, she was simply a 12-year-old girl, a daughter. A child with a life that should have continued. There should have been birthdays ahead. There should have been ordinary arguments and ordinary mornings. There should have been school days, friendships, embarrassing moments, dreams that changed every few months, and the slow transformation from childhood into adulthood. There should have been a future. Instead, her final hours became evidence. Her absence became a mystery. Her death became a case file. And her mother became the person sitting on the other side of the investigation. The most disturbing stories are not always the ones involving the most mysterious killers. Sometimes they're the stories in which the truth is hidden behind something painfully familiar. A family. A home. A relationship. A mother's voice. A child's trust. And the belief that the person standing beside you is the person who would never hurt you. On January 27th, 2008, that belief was destroyed. But at the beginning, nobody knew. The town was still searching. The police were still asking questions. People were still hoping Carissa might be found alive. And Penny Boudreau was still playing the role of the mother who wanted her daughter back. The world was looking for Carissa. Penny already knew where she was. And that terrible difference between what the world believed and what one woman knew would become the foundation of one of Nova Scotia's most haunting murder investigations. Because the search for Carissa Boudreau was never simply a search for a missing child. It was a search for the truth. And the truth was waiting in the silence. Before Carissa Boudreau became a name known across Nova Scotia, she was simply a 12-year-old girl living an ordinary life. That distinction matters. Because when a child becomes the center of a true crime story, the crime can eventually consume everything around them. The photographs, the police reports, the courtroom testimony, the headlines, the theories, the questions about motive, the arguments over punishment, the debates about parole. And somewhere beneath all of that, the person can disappear. Carissa was more than the girl who vanished on a January evening. She was more than the 12-year-old whose body was eventually found near Conquerall Bank. She was more than the daughter of Penny Boudreau. Before investigators reconstructed her final hours, Carissa had a life that was made up of small things. The kind of things that rarely appear in police files because they are not evidence. A child's habits, the way she spoke, the people she trusted, the places where she felt comfortable, the things that made her laugh. The frustrations that seemed enormous one day and insignificant the next, the ordinary rhythm of being 12 years old. And that is the life that was interrupted. The winter of 2008 had settled over Nova Scotia with the cold, subdued atmosphere that seems to make every landscape quieter. January was not a month of long afternoons or warm streets. Darkness arrived early. Roads disappeared into the night. The countryside surrounding Bridgewater could quickly become isolated, especially away from the more populated areas. But inside homes, life continued. Lights came on in windows. Families ate dinner. Children thought about school. Adults worried about bills, relationships, work, and tomorrow. Nothing about the evening had to announce that something terrible was coming. That is often the most frightening part of cases like this. There is no warning written across the sky. There is no dramatic moment when everyone suddenly understands that a life is about to end. There is simply an ordinary day. And then there is the moment after which nothing is ordinary again. For Carissa, January 27th began like a day that should have ended like any other. She was 12. At that age, The world can feel enormous and small at the same time. A child can understand adult emotions without fully understanding adult consequences. She can begin to form strong opinions. She can become more independent. She can question her parents. She can develop friendships that feel permanent. She can begin to imagine a future without knowing exactly what that future will look like. But she is still a child. She still depends upon adults. And most importantly, she still expects the adults closest to her to protect her. That expectation is almost invisible when everything is normal. A child does not usually stop to think about whether her mother is safe. She simply assumes it. That assumption is built into the relationship. If a mother tells her daughter to get into the car, the child gets into the car. If a mother says they're going somewhere, the child generally believes there is a reason. If a mother says everything is fine, a child has little reason to imagine that it is not. For Carissa, that ordinary trust would become tragically important because the person beside her during the final part of her life was Penny, her mother. The person who should have represented the safest place in the world. Instead, investigators would eventually reconstruct a sequence of events in which Penny took Carissa away from the ordinary world and into an isolated location. The details are difficult precisely because they do not begin with a stranger. They begin with a relationship, mother and daughter. The violence that followed did not require a complicated kidnapping scheme. There was no need to convince Carissa to enter an unfamiliar vehicle. She was already with someone she knew, someone whose face she recognized, someone whose voice she had heard countless times, someone whose presence, under normal circumstances, would have meant safety. That is why the psychological weight of the case is so difficult to escape. When strangers commit violence, we tend to search for the moment when trust was broken. In this case, trust was already there. Carissa did not need to be persuaded to trust her mother. That trust had been built into her entire childhood. And yet the available evidence indicates that Penny had decided to kill her. The eventual explanation offered by Penny was not that Carissa had become a dangerous person, not that Carissa had attacked her, not that Penny had acted in self-defense. According to the account that emerged, Penny wanted to preserve her relationship with Vernon McCumber. That motive is almost impossible to reconcile with the role people instinctively associate with motherhood. A relationship that could have been ended, a relationship that could have been changed, a relationship that could have survived or failed. But instead of accepting the possibility of losing an adult relationship, Penny chose to eliminate the child who stood between herself and what she wanted. That decision would later become one of the most important questions surrounding the case. What happens inside a person's mind when an ordinary emotional conflict becomes more important than another person's life? At what point does jealousy become obsession? At what point does fear of abandonment become something darker? And how does someone cross the psychological boundary between thinking something terrible and actually doing it? There are no simple answers. Human behavior rarely follows a clean line. People can experience jealousy without becoming violent. They can feel insecurity without becoming dangerous. They can fear losing someone without harming anyone. Those emotions alone do not explain murder. The significance of Penny's motive lies not in the existence of jealousy or fear, but in the extreme choice that followed. The choice to make Carissa disappear. The choice to turn a child into a problem that needed to be removed. And then, after the killing, another choice: to lie. The first act of deception would have been easier to imagine if Penny had simply fled, if she had disappeared, if she had abandoned the scene and tried to escape. But that was not what happened. Instead, Penny returned to the role of mother. She would report Carissa missing. She would allow others to believe that the child might still be alive. She would watch people begin searching. And eventually, she would appear publicly. That image would become one of the most unsettling elements of the entire case. Imagine standing among people who genuinely believe your child may still be alive. Imagine hearing strangers say they hope she is found. Imagine seeing photographs of her distributed. Imagine hearing her name spoken by people who have never met her. And imagine knowing that she will never come walking through a doorway. That is the emotional contradiction at the heart of Penny's behavior. The community was experiencing genuine fear and hope. Penny knew the truth. Those two realities existed side by side. For the people searching, every possibility was open. For Penny, the possibilities had already ended. Carissa was not missing. She was dead. Yet the search continued as if the story could still have a happy ending. The community did what communities often do when a child disappears. People wanted to help. They wanted to believe that their effort could make a difference. A missing child's photograph can create a powerful reaction because it turns an abstract tragedy into a face. You do not simply search for a 12-year-old girl. You search for Carissa. You look at her photograph. You imagine her walking down a road. You imagine her frightened. You imagine her waiting somewhere. You imagine the moment someone finds her. And for a time, that hope can become almost tangible. Every vehicle is examined. Every possible location becomes relevant. Every witness becomes important. Every minute is counted. But behind the scenes, investigators were beginning to build the first version of the timeline. And timelines are unforgiving. People remember things differently. Stories evolve. Details shift. A person may remember a time incorrectly. Another person may remember seeing a vehicle. Someone may mention a conversation that seemed meaningless at first. Individually, those details may appear insignificant. Together, they can form a pattern. In a missing person case, investigators are not simply asking, "Where is the child?" They are asking, "What should have happened?" If Carissa was supposed to be somewhere at a particular time, why was she not there? If she disappeared from a vehicle, what happened immediately before and after? If she walked away, which direction did she take? If someone took her, who could have approached her without causing alarm? If she was last seen with her mother, what did Penny say happened? And perhaps most importantly, did Penny's version of events make sense? At first, there was no reason for investigators to know that the answer might eventually be no. The investigation had only just begun. The possibility of an abduction would have to be considered. So would an accident. So would a runaway situation. So would the involvement of someone outside the family. The fact that Carissa was 12 meant that investigators could not simply assume what had happened. They had to establish it. And every passing day increased the urgency. For Penny, however, the situation was different. She already knew that the search would not end with Carissa walking back into her life. She knew that the people searching for Carissa were searching for someone who could no longer be found alive. Yet she continued to occupy the center of the story. That is where the psychological dimension becomes especially disturbing. A person who commits a homicide may experience panic afterward. They may run. They may confess. They may collapse. They may attempt suicide. They may immediately contact authorities. They may behave unpredictably. Penny did something different. She maintained a narrative. The disappearance had to appear real. The fear had to appear real. The uncertainty had to appear real. And the more convincing the performance needed to be, the more emotionally complicated the deception became. Because grief is not simply an expression. Real grief can be chaotic. It can produce anger, silence, panic, disbelief, tears, exhaustion, contradictory reactions. There is no single correct way to grieve. That is why investigators cannot determine guilt simply by looking at whether a person cries. Someone can cry and be guilty. Someone can remain calm and be innocent. Someone can appear strange because they are traumatized. Someone can appear composed because they are in shock. Behavior must be examined alongside evidence. And in Penny's case, the later investigation would become important because it moved beyond impressions. The question was no longer simply whether Penny looked like a grieving mother. The question was whether the facts supported what she was saying. Eventually, Carissa's body would provide investigators with a physical reality that could not be controlled by Penny's story. The location, the condition of the body, the clothing, the circumstances, the absence of evidence for the apparent sexual assault. These details would force investigators to reconsider what had happened. The body had become the one witness Penny could not silence. Carissa could no longer speak, but the scene could. The evidence could. The timeline could. And eventually, Penny's own words would become part of that evidence. But before the confession, before the undercover operation, before the courtroom, there was still a period in which Carissa remained officially missing. Those days must have felt unbearably long for the people who genuinely cared about her. A missing child creates a special kind of uncertainty. Death is devastating, but certainty can at least end the waiting. A disappearance leaves a door open. Maybe she is alive. Maybe someone knows where she is. Maybe the next telephone call will change everything. Maybe the next search team will find her. Maybe tomorrow. Then tomorrow comes, and she is still gone. That kind of uncertainty can consume a family. It can turn sleep into something almost impossible. Every sound outside becomes meaningful. Every unfamiliar vehicle becomes suspicious. Every telephone call creates a surge of adrenaline. And every hour without answers makes the fear deeper. For those who loved Carissa, the search was real. For Penny, investigators would later conclude, the search was something else. A performance that needed to continue until the truth could no longer be hidden. That distinction would eventually become the dividing line between the public story and the private reality. Publicly, Carissa was a missing girl. Privately, she was already a homicide victim. Publicly, Penny was her desperate mother. Privately, according to the evidence, Penny knew that she had caused her daughter's death. Publicly, people were hoping for a reunion. Privately, there was nothing left to reunite, and the further the investigation moved, the harder it would become for those two realities to exist side by side. The first stage of a murder investigation often depends upon uncertainty. The police do not know. The family does not know. The public does not know. Everyone is looking for the missing piece. But eventually, someone knows. In Carissa's case, that person was Penny, and that knowledge gave her a terrifying advantage. She knew the last place Carissa had been alive. She knew what had happened. She knew what she had done afterward. She knew that the story of a missing child was false. What she did not know was how long that story could survive. Because investigators were coming, questions were coming, evidence was coming, and eventually, the woman who had helped create the mystery would have to face the possibility that the mystery was beginning to point directly back at her. For now, however, the town still searched. The winter landscape still stretched beyond the roads. The photographs of Carissa still represented hope. And somewhere beneath that hope was a terrible truth waiting to emerge. The girl everyone wanted to bring home would never return. But the truth about what happened to her would. Slowly. Piece by piece. First through the evidence. Then through suspicion. Then through deception. And finally through Penny's own words. The investigation would reveal that the most important question was never simply where Carissa had gone. It was who had been with her when she disappeared. And the answer would lead investigators back to the person who had stood at the center of the search from the very beginning. Her mother. Penny Boudreau. The woman who told the world that Carissa was missing. The woman who knew she was not. And the woman whose story would eventually begin to break apart under the weight of the truth. There's a particular kind of silence that follows a disappearance. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of people waiting for an answer. In the days after Carissa Boudreau vanished, that silence settled over Bridgewater in a way that was almost impossible to escape. People talked about her everywhere. In homes. In stores. On telephones. Among neighbors. Among volunteers. Her photograph became familiar to people who had never met her. A 12-year-old girl who, only days earlier, had been an ordinary child was suddenly the center of a community's attention. And every person who looked at that photograph was looking for the same thing. A clue. A familiar face. A detail they might have overlooked. Anything that could explain where Carissa had gone. But there was one person who did not need to look at the photograph to know where she was. Penny Boudreau already knew. That fact changes the meaning of everything that came afterward. A mother joining a search party can look like love. A mother answering questions can look like cooperation. A mother speaking to reporters can look like desperation. A mother asking strangers for help can look like courage. But if that mother already knows her child is dead, every one of those actions becomes something else. The difference is invisible from the outside. That is what makes deception so powerful. It does not have to look like deception. It can wear the face of grief. It can speak in the language of fear. It can stand beneath television cameras and ask strangers to keep looking. And perhaps the most unsettling part is that the people watching may genuinely want to believe it. They want the mother to be innocent. They want the child to be alive. They want the story to end differently. That emotional instinct can become an advantage for someone who is lying, because when the truth is unbearable, people sometimes cling to the version of events that gives them hope. In the early days of the search, that hope was still alive. Carissa could still, theoretically, be anywhere. A road. A house. A wooded area. A vehicle. Somewhere beyond the places investigators had already searched. The possibilities were terrifying, but they were still possibilities. And Penny was positioned at the center of them. She knew details about Carissa's habits. She knew her routines. She knew where she had been. She knew the circumstances surrounding the final hours. That made her both a source of information and, eventually, a person investigators would have to examine closely. But investigations rarely move in a straight line. They move through uncertainty. A detective may suspect one possibility one morning and abandon it by evening. A witness may remember something that changes the timeline. A piece of physical evidence may point in a direction nobody expected. A statement that sounds harmless can become significant days later. That is how cases are built. Not from one dramatic revelation, but from hundreds of small pieces that eventually begin to fit together. In Carissa's case, those pieces would eventually create a picture very different from the one Penny had presented. But at the beginning, investigators had to work with the story in front of them. Carissa had disappeared. Her mother had reported it. The community was searching. The clock was moving. And somewhere in that landscape, there was a child who needed to be found. The emotional pressure of a missing child investigation is difficult to describe. Every hour feels heavier than the last. The first hours carry urgency. Then comes exhaustion. Then fear. Then the possibility that the worst outcome may already have happened. For volunteers, searching can become physically punishing. The weather does not stop because someone is missing. Cold remains cold. Darkness still arrives. Roads remain dangerous. The terrain does not become easier simply because a family is desperate. Yet people keep going. They search because they believe there must be an answer. They search because they believe effort matters. They search because they imagine Carissa somewhere, perhaps frightened, perhaps waiting. And all the while, the investigation was moving toward a reality that none of those people wanted to consider. Carissa had not simply disappeared. She had been killed. The question was why. And the answer would lead into the private world of Penny Boudreau, a world where relationships, fear, jealousy, and emotional dependence had become intertwined with a decision that could never be undone. According to the account that later emerged, Penny's relationship with Vernon McCumber was central to the motive. The details of human relationships are rarely simple. People can become attached to one another in ways that are difficult for outsiders to understand. They can become dependent. They can become afraid of abandonment. They can convince themselves that losing a relationship would mean losing everything. That does not make violence inevitable. It does not make murder understandable. But it can reveal the emotional distortion, through which an offender begins to see the world. Instead of seeing choices, they see threats. Instead of seeing consequences, they see obstacles. Instead of seeing another human being, they begin to see a problem. That transformation is one of the darkest elements of criminal psychology. Carissa was not merely a child in Penny's life. She was her daughter. But according to the motive Penny later described, Carissa had become connected in Penny's mind to the future of her relationship with Macomber. And once a child becomes psychologically reframed as an obstacle, the unimaginable can become thinkable. The tragedy is that Carissa was not responsible for the conflict. She did not create the adult relationship. She did not control whether it survived. She did not deserve to become the price of someone else's fear. Yet she paid that price with her life. The killing itself would later be described in stark physical terms. Penny took Carissa to an isolated area. There was a confrontation. Penny restrained her daughter. Carissa was forced down. A cord was used to strangle her. The simplicity of the description makes it almost harder to comprehend. There was no great mystery in the physical act. No supernatural explanation. No unknown predator. There was a mother and a child, a decision, an act of violence, and then silence. Once Carissa was dead, Penny faced another decision. What would she do now? There was no way to undo what had happened. No way to return to the moment before the violence. No way to restore Carissa's heartbeat. No way to erase the fact that a child was dead. There was only what came next. And what came next was deception. The body had to remain hidden. The disappearance had to appear real. Penny had to return to the world of ordinary people and behave as though the most important thing in her life was finding her daughter. That is a psychologically demanding task. A lie told once is one thing. A lie that must survive an investigation is something else entirely. Every question becomes dangerous. What time did you last see her? Where were you? What did she say? What was she wearing? Where were you driving? Why did you go there? Who did you speak to? What did you do afterward? The more investigators ask, the more opportunities a false story has to contradict itself. And investigators ask because details matter. A missing person's timeline can sometimes be reconstructed down to individual minutes. Vehicles leave traces. Telephone calls create records. People remember seeing one another. Roads have distances. Places have physical characteristics. The world itself becomes a witness. A person can lie. A landscape cannot. That would become increasingly important in the Carissa Boudreaux investigation, because Penny had created a story, but the evidence would eventually have to determine whether that story was possible. At first, however, the story still had room to breathe. There was no body. Without a body, the investigation had to remain open to multiple possibilities. Carissa could have been abducted. She could have been taken by someone who knew her. She could have wandered away. She could have been harmed by someone outside the family. The investigators could not simply decide that the mother was responsible because she had been the last known person with the child. They needed evidence. And evidence takes time. That time allowed Penny to continue performing the role she had chosen. The desperate mother. The woman waiting for her daughter. The parent who wanted answers. To the people around her, the distinction between real grief and performed grief may have been impossible to see. This is another reason the case remains psychologically disturbing. There was no obvious monster standing in front of the cameras. There was a mother. And the public had been trained, almost instinctively, to feel sympathy for her. When a child disappears, people naturally look toward the parent, not necessarily with suspicion, with compassion. They imagine the terror of losing a child. They imagine the empty bedroom, the unanswered telephone, the uncertainty, the possibility of never knowing. That emotional connection can be overwhelming. And if the parent is the offender, it creates an almost unbearable contradiction. The person receiving sympathy may be the person who caused the tragedy. The person asking for help may know there is no child left to rescue. The person standing beside the photograph may know exactly what happened behind the photograph. That contradiction would eventually become one of the most haunting aspects of Penny's story. But there was another element that would soon complicate the investigation. Vernon McCumber, Penny's boyfriend, was not simply a peripheral figure. His relationship with Penny made him relevant. If the motive involved Penny's fear of losing him, investigators had to ask whether he knew anything about what had happened. Could he have been involved? Could he have encouraged Penny? Could he have helped? Could he have known about the killing afterward? Those questions had to be answered. McCumber became part of the investigation, and for a time, suspicion surrounding him would have to be taken seriously. This is another uncomfortable reality of criminal investigations. Investigators cannot follow emotion. They cannot say, "This person seems like a good man," or "This person looks suspicious." They have to follow evidence. They have to consider people who may ultimately be innocent, and they have to be willing to abandon a theory when the evidence no longer supports it. The investigation would eventually reveal that the path through McCumber was not the final answer. Instead, the attention would increasingly return to Penny, and that shift would become decisive. The story was beginning to change. What had initially looked like a missing child investigation was becoming a murder investigation. What had seemed like an unknown predator began to look more like someone inside Carissa's circle. And the question was becoming more specific. Not simply, "Where is Carissa?" but, "Who wanted Carissa gone?" The answer was waiting inside the motive, and motive was waiting inside Penny's relationship. Yet even motive alone would not be enough. People can have reasons to be angry, reasons to be jealous, reasons to resent someone. That does not prove murder. Investigators needed something stronger. They needed Penny's story to collide with evidence. They needed her version of events to become impossible to maintain. And eventually, they would get that opportunity. The discovery of Carissa's body would change everything. Until then, the missing child remained a possibility. Afterward, there would be no possibility of a happy ending. Only questions. The location where she was found, the condition of her clothing, the apparent staging of the scene, the absence of evidence supporting sexual assault. Each detail would force investigators to reconsider the narrative. Why would someone make the scene look like a sexual attack? Why would someone want investigators to believe a stranger had done this? What did that person hope the police would think? And who would benefit from that confusion? A stranger could have committed the crime, but a stranger would have had to find Carissa. A stranger would have had to gain access to her. A stranger would have had to know enough about her movements. And a stranger would have had to somehow place her body where she was eventually discovered. The closer investigators looked, the more complicated the stranger theory became. Meanwhile, Penny's position was becoming more uncomfortable. She was no longer simply the mother of a missing girl. She was the mother of a murdered girl, and the last known person with her. That distinction changes everything. Every statement becomes more important. Every memory is examined. Every inconsistency becomes a potential clue. Every unexplained detail becomes another thread investigators can pull. But perhaps Penny believed she could keep control. Perhaps she believed the evidence was not strong enough. Perhaps she believed the story would remain intact. Perhaps she believed that if she could keep everyone looking outward, nobody would look closely enough at her. If so, she was wrong. Because investigators were not finished. They were preparing a strategy that would eventually place Penny in a situation where she believed she was speaking to someone who could help her. She did not know that the conversation was designed to uncover the truth. She did not know that her own words could become the most powerful evidence against her. And she did not know that the carefully constructed story of a missing daughter was approaching its final days. The lie had survived the first hours. It had survived the first wave of public attention. It had survived the search. It had survived the discovery of Carissa's body. But now the investigation was entering a different phase. The phase where investigators stop asking only what happened and begin asking whether the person telling the story can be trusted. The phase where every detail is tested. The phase where the investigation becomes less about finding a missing girl and more about identifying the person who took her life. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the circle began to close around Penny. The woman who had first stood at the center of the search was now standing at the center of suspicion. The same mother who had asked the world to help find Carissa was now being examined as someone who might know far more than she had admitted. And the tragedy was that Carissa was no longer there to defend herself. She could not explain the final conversation with her mother. She could not describe the drive. She could not tell investigators what she felt when the situation changed. She could not contradict Penny's account. She could not point toward the truth. The only things left behind were physical evidence, timelines, memories, and eventually, the words of the person responsible. That would become the path forward. But before the truth could be extracted, investigators had to navigate the maze Penny had created. And every maze has a center. In this case, the center was not a mysterious stranger. It was a mother. A woman who had looked into the eyes of a 12-year-old girl and made a decision that could never be undone. A woman who then returned to the community and allowed people to search for that girl. A woman who watched hope grow around a child who was already dead. And a woman who, for a time, appeared to be waiting for the same answer as everyone else. Where is Carissa? The truth was much darker. Carissa was not waiting somewhere. She was not hiding. She was not lost. She was not coming home. And the woman who knew that was still telling everyone else to keep looking. That was the lie. And now investigators had to find the evidence that would break it. Before Carissa Boudreaux became the center of a murder investigation, before her photograph appeared in newspapers and on television screens, before police began reconstructing the final hours of her life, there was a place that knew her as something other than a victim. That place was Bridgewater, a small community in Nova Scotia, Canada. Bridgewater is the kind of town where distance can feel different from distance in a major city. A few roads can take you from populated streets into quiet countryside. Buildings and houses gradually give way to trees, fields, and stretches of road where another vehicle can disappear from sight within seconds. Places that look ordinary in daylight can become isolated after dark. For a child, that landscape can feel familiar. For investigators searching for a missing child, it can become enormous. In January, winter changes the character of Nova Scotia. The landscape loses much of the softness it carries during warmer months. Trees stand bare or dark beneath the gray sky. The ground can be hard and cold. Daylight is short. The edges of roads, fields, and wooded areas seem to merge into one another as evening approaches. It was against that winter landscape that Carissa disappeared. There was nothing theatrical about the setting. No towering city skyline. No crowded downtown packed with strangers. No maze of apartment buildings where a person could vanish among thousands of faces. Instead, there were roads, homes, wooded areas, and a community in which people could still feel connected to the places around them. That sense of community would become important after Carissa disappeared. When a child goes missing, geography becomes more than geography. A road becomes a possible route. A field becomes a search area. A wooded patch becomes something investigators must examine. A parking lot becomes a place where someone may have seen something. A vehicle becomes a potential clue. Every ordinary location acquires a second identity. It becomes part of the investigation. For the people who lived around Bridgewater, those places had always been familiar. They were simply part of daily life. But after January 27th, 2008, people began looking at them differently. The roads were no longer just roads. They were routes that Carissa might have traveled. The surrounding countryside was no longer simply scenery. It might contain an answer. And the silence of the landscape, which had once been ordinary, became deeply unsettling. Bridgewater itself sits within the Lunenburg County region of Nova Scotia, an area shaped by the relationship between community and countryside. The town has long served as a center for surrounding communities, with roads carrying people between residential areas, businesses, schools, and more isolated rural locations. That mixture creates an important backdrop for the case. Carissa's story did not unfold inside a sealed environment. It unfolded in a place where a person could move relatively quickly between populated and secluded areas. A short drive could change the atmosphere completely. One moment, there could be houses and other vehicles nearby. Then the surroundings could become quieter. The number of people visible along the road could diminish. The landscape could open up, and once darkness settled in, visibility would become even more limited. For investigators, understanding that geography would eventually become essential. A murder is not only about what happened, it is also about where it happened. Distance matters. Travel time matters. The condition of roads matters. The locations of homes and businesses matter. The movements of vehicles matter. And when a suspect gives a version of events, investigators can compare that version with the physical world. Could the person have traveled from one location to another in the stated amount of time? Would someone have been likely to see them? Was the route consistent with the account? Did the location make sense? Was there a reason to be there? These questions may seem mundane, but criminal investigations are often built on mundane details. A person may remember a major event incorrectly, but a vehicle traveling down a particular road at a particular time can sometimes leave a trail of information. A telephone call can establish that someone was awake. A witness can place a person somewhere. A receipt can reveal a movement. A physical object can contradict an entire story. That is the nature of evidence. It does not need to be dramatic. It only needs to be true. And in Carissa's case, the truth would eventually emerge from details that, at first, may have seemed ordinary. But before the investigation began pulling those details apart, there was a family. Penny Boudreau was Carissa's mother. Vernon McCumber was Penny's boyfriend. Carissa was 12 years old. These three people formed a small domestic world that, from the outside, might not have appeared extraordinary. There were relationships. There were tensions. There were emotional attachments. There were the ordinary complications that can exist inside any household. But beneath that surface, something had changed. Penny's relationship with McCumber would become central to understanding the motive. According to the account that later emerged, Penny was deeply concerned about preserving that relationship. The idea that an adult relationship could become more important than the life of a child is difficult to comprehend. But the role of motive in a murder investigation is not to make the crime acceptable. It is to help investigators understand how a person arrived at the decision to commit it. A motive can explain the direction of a person's thinking without excusing the result. And in this case, the motive points toward an emotional world in which Penny's fear of losing her relationship had become powerful enough to influence an unthinkable decision. Carissa, however, was 12. She had no responsibility for the stability of the adults around her. She did not control Penny's relationship. She could not decide whether Penny and McCumber stayed together. She was simply a child living inside a family structure created by adults. That distinction is crucial, because once investigators began looking at the motive, they were not simply trying to understand why Penny might have been angry. They were trying to understand why Carissa had been transformed, in Penny's thinking, from a daughter into an obstacle. That psychological transformation is one of the darkest parts of the story. Most parents experience conflict with their children. Children argue. Children resist. Children test boundaries. Adolescents become more independent. Families experience tension, but those moments normally remain inside the boundaries of ordinary family life. A parent may become frustrated. A child may become angry. Then the moment passes. The relationship continues. For Penny and Carissa, something far more destructive happened. Whatever tensions existed between them were ultimately overshadowed by Penny's decision to kill her daughter. And once that decision was made, the ordinary family relationship became part of the crime itself. The car became important. The journey became important. The locations became important. The final moments became important. Every ordinary detail surrounding Carissa's life was transformed into evidence. That is one of the cruelest consequences of homicide. After a person dies, the smallest objects can suddenly become sacred. A photograph, a piece of clothing, a personal possession, a bedroom, a school item. Something that was once ordinary becomes a reminder of the person who is gone. For investigators, those objects may become evidence. For families, they can become the last physical connection to someone they love. For Carissa's family and community, the disappearance created an absence that could be felt everywhere. An empty place, a missing voice, a photograph where a living child should have been. And while people searched, the story of Carissa began to spread beyond the immediate circle of people who knew her. Her disappearance became public. The community became involved, and the case began moving toward the kind of attention that surrounds missing children. The more people who heard about Carissa, the more people became invested in finding her. That investment was genuine. People did not know that the central story was false. They were not participating in a deception. They were trying to help. That makes what happened afterward particularly painful. Every person who searched believed their effort might save a child. Every person who shared information believed the next person might know something. Every person who looked at Carissa's photograph could imagine the possibility that she might still be alive. And while that hope spread outward, Penny carried the truth inward. The contrast between those two realities is one of the defining features of the case. Outside Penny's mind, the search was still open. Inside it, the ending had already occurred. This is also where the landscape of Nova Scotia becomes more than a background. Winter can hide things. Not intentionally, of course. Nature does not understand crime. But darkness reduces visibility. Distance creates isolation. Cold can discourage movement. Rural areas can contain places where few people pass at certain times of day. And for someone trying to conceal a crime, those conditions can become significant. That does not mean a landscape itself creates violence. It simply provides physical circumstances within which human decisions take place. Penny knew the area. She knew the roads. She knew the environment. And eventually, Carissa's body would be found in the Conquerall Bank area. The discovery would transform the meaning of the landscape. A place that had existed long before the crime would become permanently associated with it. For investigators, it became a crime scene. For the community, it became the place where the search ended. For Carissa, it became the final location of her life. That distinction is difficult to express. A place can remain physically unchanged, while its emotional meaning changes forever. A road can still carry traffic. Trees can still move in the wind. People can still pass through. But once a child's body is discovered there, those surroundings can become inseparable from the memory of what happened. The same is true of the roads that connected Bridgewater to the surrounding areas. Investigators would later have to reconstruct movement. They would need to understand where Penny and Carissa had gone. They would need to consider how long the journey could have taken. They would need to determine whether Penny's account was compatible with the geography. And eventually, they would have to ask the most important geographical question of all. Why there? Why that location? Why did Carissa end up where she was found? If the scene had been chosen deliberately, then the location itself could provide insight into the offender's thinking. Perhaps isolation mattered. Perhaps privacy mattered. Perhaps the offender wanted distance from witnesses. Perhaps the location had some personal significance. Or perhaps it was simply somewhere the offender believed would provide enough concealment. The answers would emerge slowly. But the first stage of understanding the crime begins with understanding the place. Bridgewater was not merely the town where Carissa disappeared. It was the center of the world in which her final story unfolded. The community knew the roads. The police knew the roads. Volunteers searched them. And Penny knew them too. That shared geography meant that the investigation could never be separated from the environment. Every movement had to make sense. Every claimed destination had to be examined. Every unexplained detour could matter, and every location associated with Carissa became another piece of the puzzle. Yet there was something even more important than the geography. There was time. January 27th was not simply the day Carissa disappeared. It was the final day of her life. That makes every hour meaningful. What happened in the morning? What happened in the afternoon? Who saw Carissa? When did she leave? When did she enter Penny's vehicle? Where did they go? What happened before the reported disappearance? What happened afterward? The investigators would eventually reconstruct those movements with increasing precision. But in the beginning, they had only fragments. A mother's account, witness memories, the physical environment, and the absence of Carissa. The first version of the story was therefore simple. Carissa had disappeared, but the more investigators learned about the circumstances surrounding her disappearance, the less simple that story became. Because the person who reported her missing had been with her, and the mother knew far more than she was saying, that would eventually become the central conflict of the investigation. Penny's story versus the evidence. Her account versus the landscape. Her version of the timeline versus the physical facts. And ultimately, her public identity as Carissa's grieving mother versus the private truth of what she had done. But none of that could erase the reality that existed before the crime. Carissa had once been alive. She had a voice. She had relationships. She had a future. She had a place in the community. And the people who knew her did not see a case file when they thought of her. They saw a child. That is why the setting matters. Not because the streets of Bridgewater are inherently sinister. They are not. Not because the rural landscape somehow predicted the crime. It did not. The setting matters because this was a real place inhabited by real people, and the crime entered that ordinary world without warning. A town woke up one day with a child missing. People who had never imagined becoming involved in a homicide investigation found themselves searching roads and fields. Police officers who began with a missing person report eventually found themselves investigating the death of a 12-year-old girl. And a family that had once been defined by ordinary relationships became defined by tragedy. The landscape remained. The roads remained. The houses remained. The seasons changed. But Carissa did not get to grow older. That is the quiet tragedy beneath every detail of this case. While the investigation would eventually become complicated, the essential truth remained painfully simple. A 12-year-old girl had been alive on January 27th. By the end of that day, she was not. And the person who knew that reality, while the rest of the community searched, was the person who had been closest to her, her mother. To understand how such a crime could happen, investigators would eventually have to look beyond the roads and locations. They would have to look inside the family, inside the relationships, inside Penny's emotional world, inside the tension surrounding Vernon McCumber. And most importantly, they would have to understand Carissa herself, because before investigators could reconstruct the crime, they needed to understand the person who had been lost. The next part of the story therefore moves away from the landscape and toward the child, away from the roads, away from the search, away from the headlines, toward Carissa Boudreaux as a person, not as evidence, not as a photograph, not as a murder victim, but as a 12-year-old girl who had a life before the world learned her name for the worst possible reason. And that life is where the story truly belongs. A murder investigation can reduce a family to a handful of names: the mother, the boyfriend, the daughter, the police, the suspect, the victim. But real families do not begin as case files. They begin with relationships. And relationships are rarely simple. Before investigators began examining Penny Boudreaux as a potential killer, she was Carissa's mother. Before Vernon McCumber became a person of interest, he was Penny's partner. Before Carissa's name became associated with one of Nova Scotia's most disturbing homicide cases, she was a 12-year-old girl living within that complicated family structure. understanding that background matters because the crime did not emerge from nowhere. There was a life before January 27th, 2008. There were routines. There were expectations. There were relationships that had developed over time. And there were emotional tensions that investigators would eventually have to examine in order to understand why Penny made the decision she did. The available record does not provide a complete portrait of every ordinary day in Carissa's childhood. There are gaps that cannot responsibly be filled with invented details. We do not know every favorite song she listened to, every joke she told her friends, every argument she had with her mother, or every dream she carried about the future. Those things may have existed, but a true account has to distinguish between what is documented and what can only be imagined. What we do know is enough to establish the central reality. Carissa was 12 years old. She was Penny's daughter. She was living within a household that included Penny's boyfriend, Vernon McCumber. And by the final months of Carissa's life, the relationship between these adults would become central to the story of her death. That is where the family structure becomes important. A child does not choose the emotional landscape into which she is born. Adults make decisions about relationships. Adults decide whether relationships continue. Adults carry the responsibility for managing conflict. Children live with the consequences. Carissa was not responsible for the relationship between Penny and Vernon. She did not create whatever tensions existed between the adults. She did not control Penny's emotions. She could not determine whether Vernon remained with Penny. Yet, according to the motive that later emerged, Penny's fear surrounding that relationship became intertwined with Carissa's fate. That is one of the most difficult elements of the case to understand. The supposed problem was an adult relationship. The person who paid the ultimate price was a child. There is an enormous psychological distance between those two things. A relationship can end. A partner can leave. People can separate. People can rebuild their lives. People can endure heartbreak. But a child cannot simply be removed from the equation because an adult fears losing a romantic relationship. Yet that is precisely the direction in which Penny's thinking appears to have moved. The horror of the case is not that the motive was incomprehensible. It is that the motive was rooted in an ordinary human emotion and carried to an extraordinary and devastating extreme. Fear, attachment, jealousy, possessiveness, the fear of abandonment. These emotions exist in many human lives. Most people experience them without violence. Most people find ways to survive rejection, separation, disappointment, and loss. The difference lies in what a person does with those emotions. Penny's alleged response was catastrophic, and Carissa became the victim of that response. The family, therefore, has to be viewed through two different lenses. There was the family as it appeared from the outside, and there was the emotional reality investigators would later attempt to reconstruct. From the outside, there was a mother, her daughter, and her mother's boyfriend. From the inside, there may have been tensions and insecurities that outsiders could not fully see. But even when a family is complicated, that does not make murder inevitable. This distinction is essential. A troubled relationship does not automatically produce a violent offender. A parent's jealousy does not automatically produce a killer. A difficult family dynamic does not excuse or explain away the deliberate taking of a child's life. What it can do is provide investigators with a possible path into the offender's decision-making. And that path led back to Vernon McCumber. Penny's relationship with McCumber was not simply background information. It became part of the prosecution's understanding of motive. According to the account that emerged after Penny's arrest, she believed that Carissa threatened the stability of her relationship with McCumber. That belief, whether rational or not, became central to the explanation of the crime. This is where the distinction between reality and perception becomes important. A person can believe that someone is standing between them and what they want. That does not mean the person actually is. Carissa could not determine whether Penny and Vernon stayed together. Carissa did not possess that power. The relationship belonged to the adults. But in Penny's thinking, The situation had apparently become simplified into a terrible equation. If Carissa remained, perhaps Penny feared that she would lose Vernon. If Carissa disappeared, perhaps Penny believed the relationship could survive. That is not a conclusion a healthy mind would reach. It is the product of an extreme distortion of priorities. The life of a child became less important than the preservation of an adult relationship. And once that calculation was made, the consequences were irreversible. For Carissa, the adults around her were not abstract figures in a psychological conflict. They were simply the people in her immediate world. Her mother was her mother. Vernon was her mother's boyfriend. The complexities of adult relationships belong to adults. A 12-year-old should never have to carry the consequences of an adult's fear of abandonment. Yet Carissa did. The case also raises another uncomfortable question. How much can a child understand about tension between adults? Children often notice more than adults realize. They may not understand the full reasons behind arguments. They may not understand financial pressures, romantic insecurity, resentment, or emotional dependence. But they can sense changes. They can recognize anger in a voice. They can notice when adults stop speaking. They can feel when a room becomes tense. They can understand that something is wrong even when nobody explains what it is. We cannot know precisely what Carissa understood about Penny's relationship with Vernon. The available information does not allow us to reconstruct every thought in her mind. But we do know something far more important. Whatever tensions existed, Carissa was ultimately placed in a situation where she could not escape the consequences. The final day of her life began within that family context. She was with her mother. There was no stranger required to gain her trust. No elaborate abduction plan was necessary. No complicated deception was needed to persuade her to enter Penny's vehicle. The trust already existed. That is one of the reasons the crime feels so intimate. The closer we look, the less the case resembles the stereotypical image of a child abduction. There was no mysterious predator emerging from an unknown corner of the community. The danger came from within the relationship that should have offered protection. And this changes how we understand the word missing. When Carissa was reported missing, the public imagined a child who had somehow been separated from the people who loved her. But Carissa had not been separated from her mother. She had been with her mother. The separation was created by the person who was supposed to prevent it. That is a profound inversion of the parent-child relationship. The protector became the threat. The person expected to bring the child home became the person who knew there was no homecoming. And the person expected to tell the truth became the person who constructed the story. This is also why the role of Vernon McCumber is important without making him responsible for a crime the available evidence does not establish he committed. At different stages, investigators had to consider whether he knew about or participated in Carissa's killing. That was a legitimate investigative question. If Penny's motive was connected to the relationship, investigators needed to know whether Vernon had any involvement. Was he aware of what Penny intended? Did he know what had happened? Had he participated in any way? Or was Penny acting alone? Those questions could not be answered through assumption. They required investigation. McCumber's presence therefore became another thread in the case. And eventually, investigators would use him in an unusual way. But before that happened, the family remained at the center of the investigation. The discovery of Carissa's body would make the family structure even more significant. Once a missing child is found dead, investigators naturally begin with the people closest to her. That does not mean every family member is guilty. It means proximity creates opportunity and information. Who saw the child last? Who knew her routine? Who knew where she would be? Who could approach her without causing fear? Who had access to her? Who could have transported her? Who knew the places where she might be hidden? And who had a reason to want her gone? The answers increasingly pointed toward Penny, but there was another dimension. Penny had not simply been the last person with Carissa. She had also become the public face of the search. That meant the family tragedy was being played out in two worlds at once. Inside the family, something had happened that could never be undone. Outside the family, people were still trying to find the missing girl. Those two realities were fundamentally incompatible. Yet Penny managed to occupy both. She could speak as a mother while knowing she had killed her daughter. She could listen to questions about Carissa while knowing the answers. She could allow people to hope while knowing the hope was false. That requires a particular kind of psychological compartmentalization. Again, the evidence does not allow us to diagnose Penny from a distance. It would be irresponsible to assign a psychiatric label simply because her actions were horrific. But her behavior after the killing does demonstrate something important. She was capable of maintaining a false narrative in the immediate aftermath of her daughter's death. That behavior became part of the investigation because the lie was not a single moment. It was sustained. And sustained deception requires decisions. A person has to choose what to say, what not to say, what details to emphasize, what details to avoid, how to respond when challenged, how to behave when others become emotional, how to react when new evidence appears. Every additional day gives investigators more opportunities to compare the story against reality. That is why time can become an enemy for a person attempting to conceal a homicide. At first, the story may appear coherent. Then another piece of evidence appears. A witness remembers something. A timeline changes. A location raises questions. A physical detail contradicts the account. Slowly, the story begins to develop cracks. The cracks do not necessarily appear dramatic. Sometimes they are tiny. A detail that does not fit. A statement that seems unnecessary. An explanation that requires another explanation. But investigators know that small inconsistencies can matter. And Carissa's case was gradually moving toward that stage. The family story could no longer remain purely private. It was being examined by police. The relationship between Penny and Vernon was being examined. The circumstances of Carissa's disappearance were being examined. And eventually, the scene where Carissa's body was found would provide another major question. Why had her clothing been disturbed? Why did the scene appear to suggest sexual assault when the evidence did not support that conclusion? If someone had deliberately created that impression, what were they trying to accomplish? The possibility of staging changed the way investigators had to think. A stranger might commit a sexual assault and murder. But if there was no evidence of sexual assault, another explanation had to be considered. Perhaps someone wanted the police to imagine a stranger. Perhaps someone wanted the investigation to move away from the family. Perhaps the appearance of the scene was intended to create confusion. If that was the case, then the killer had not simply committed a murder. The killer had also attempted to control the investigation. And controlling an investigation requires forethought. It requires awareness of what police may look for. It requires an understanding of what a crime scene might suggest. Or, at minimum, it requires a desire to create a particular impression. The more investigators considered these possibilities, the more the case began moving away from a random act of violence. The crime was beginning to look like something that had been followed by efforts to conceal its true nature. And concealment brought investigators back to the person with the most obvious connection to Carissa, Penny, the mother. The woman who had reported her daughter missing. The woman whose romantic relationship had become part of the suspected motive. The woman who knew Carissa's movements. The woman who had been with her before the disappearance. And eventually, the woman whose own words would become the key to understanding what had happened. But at this point in the story, the investigators did not yet have the complete picture. They had questions. They had suspicions. They had a dead child. They had a mother whose story needed to be examined. And they had Vernon McCumber, whose role had to be determined. The investigation would become increasingly sophisticated. One of its most important developments would involve an undercover officer approaching McCumber in custody. The officer would create the impression that he was connected to people capable of helping with the disposal of evidence. The goal was not simply to frighten Penny. It was to create an environment in which she might believe that revealing information could protect her. This strategy would eventually bring Penny's own words into the case. But before that moment, the investigators had to build enough understanding to know where to look. They had to separate fact from performance. They had to distinguish genuine grief from the appearance of grief. They had to determine whether Macomber was involved. They had to reconstruct the movements of Penny and Carissa, and they had to understand why someone would want the investigation to look in the wrong direction. That process takes us deeper into the family, because the most important question was no longer simply what happened to Carissa. It was what Carissa represented inside Penny's emotional world. A daughter, a child, a responsibility, or, in the distorted thinking that preceded the murder, an obstacle. The answer is devastating. Carissa was 12 years old. She should have been protected from the consequences of adult romantic conflict. Instead, according to the motive Penny later described, that conflict became one of the reasons she was killed. And this is where the story becomes larger than one crime. It becomes a story about what can happen when a person's emotional priorities become so distorted that another human life is reduced to a problem. It becomes a story about possession, about fear of abandonment, about the difference between loving someone and believing you have the right to control what happens around them. And above all, it becomes a story about the cost of placing an adult desire above a child's life. Carissa did not choose the circumstances surrounding her final day. She did not choose the relationship between Penny and Vernon. She did not choose the location where she would die. She did not choose to become the subject of a missing person search. She did not choose to become a homicide victim. Those choices belonged to someone else. And once investigators understood that, the family itself became the map. Every relationship pointed somewhere. Every connection raised another question. Every unanswered detail demanded attention. The road ahead would eventually lead to a confession. But before that confession, there would be suspicion. There would be doubt. There would be interrogation. There would be an undercover operation. And there would be a moment when the carefully protected secret surrounding Carissa's death would finally begin to emerge from the person who had been carrying it. For nearly 2 weeks, the community had been asking the same question. Where is Carissa Boudreau? But the investigators were beginning to ask a different one. What was Penny Boudreau trying to hide? And once that question became the center of the investigation, the search for a missing child became something else entirely. It became the search for the truth inside a family that had been broken from within. The most important places in a murder investigation are not always the places where the crime itself is committed. Sometimes they're the places that came before. The driveway, the road, the vehicle, the last familiar turn, the final ordinary stretch of pavement separating a child from the moment her life would change forever. For Carissa Boudreau, the road mattered, not because roads are inherently dangerous, but because movement creates a timeline. A person cannot simply appear somewhere. There is usually a path. A vehicle has to travel. A distance has to be crossed. And when investigators reconstruct a homicide, those distances become silent witnesses. On January 27, 2008, Penny and Carissa were together. At some point during that day, mother and daughter entered the same vehicle and began moving through the world that Carissa knew. For Carissa, there was no reason to understand that this journey would become the final journey of her life. She was not entering the vehicle of a stranger. She was with her mother. That detail changes the emotional landscape of the case. The danger did not announce itself. There was no obvious boundary between safety and danger. The journey could have looked completely ordinary. A child sitting in a car, a mother driving, roads passing outside the windows, the winter landscape moving slowly past them. And then, somewhere along that journey, the ordinary world disappeared. Investigators would eventually establish that Penny took Carissa to an isolated area outside Bridgewater. The precise emotional experience of that journey can never be known with certainty. Carissa cannot tell us what she thought. She cannot describe what was said. She cannot tell us whether she sensed something was wrong. She cannot explain the final moments from her own perspective. That silence is one of the most painful aspects of the case. The victim is the one person who cannot speak. Everything else must be reconstructed by people who arrived afterward. Investigators, witnesses, forensic specialists, people who knew the family, and eventually, Penny herself. But a confession can tell us what an offender says happened. It cannot restore the victim's voice. That is why a responsible account must be careful. Where the evidence ends, speculation must stop. We can examine the facts. We can examine the motive. We can examine the behavior. But we cannot invent Carissa's final thoughts. We cannot claim to know whether she was frightened at a particular moment. We cannot put words into her mouth. We can only recognize the terrible reality that a 12-year-old child was placed in a situation she had every reason to trust was safe. That trust was betrayed. The location where Penny ultimately took Carissa was more isolated than the places where ordinary community life unfolded. Isolation can be difficult to understand until it becomes part of a crime. In a populated area, there are eyes. People driving past. People entering buildings. People walking dogs. People standing near windows. There is noise. There is movement. There are interruptions. In an isolated area, those protections diminish. The road can be empty. The surrounding land can stretch outward without witnesses. A person can disappear from view quickly. For someone planning to conceal violence, that difference can matter. And Penny knew enough about the area to take Carissa away from the center of public life. The journey itself, therefore, became part of the investigation. Why did they go there? What was the purpose of the trip? What happened before they arrived? What happened after? And most importantly, why did Carissa not come back? These questions would become increasingly important once her body was discovered. But before the discovery, investigators had to work from the information Penny provided. That meant the road existed in two versions. There was the physical road, the actual distance, the actual locations, the actual movement of the vehicle. And there was the road as described by Penny, the story she gave police, the locations she mentioned, the timeline she presented. In a homicide investigation, those two versions must eventually match. If they do not, investigators ask why. A person may simply be mistaken. Memory is imperfect. People can misremember times. They can confuse dates. They can forget details. But when the inconsistencies involve the last known movements of a murdered child, investigators cannot simply ignore them. Every discrepancy becomes worth examining. This is especially true when the person giving the account is the last known person to have been with the victim. Penny therefore became both witness and subject. She had information investigators desperately needed, but she also had a reason to conceal information. That dual role would make the investigation increasingly complicated. The disappearance itself had initially created a large field of possibilities, but the discovery of Carissa's body narrowed that field. The case was no longer about where a child might be. It was about who had taken her life and why. And the answer could not be separated from the final journey. The vehicle became significant. The route became significant. The time became significant. The locations became significant. Every movement had to be examined. This is how a seemingly ordinary journey can become a forensic map. A road that Penny may have traveled dozens of times could suddenly become evidence. A turn could become a clue. A location could become a question. A delay could become suspicious. A statement about where someone had been could be tested against the geography. And geography is difficult to negotiate with. A person can persuade another person. They can cry. They can become angry. They can deny. They can tell a convincing story. But a road remains where it is. A distance remains the same. A location cannot be emotionally manipulated. That is why investigators often reconstruct a suspect's movements with such precision. They are not simply trying to catch someone in a lie. They are trying to determine whether the story could have happened at all. For Carissa, the final journey ended in violence. According to the account that later emerged, Penny attacked her daughter at the isolated location. She restrained Carissa. She forced her down, and she used a cord to strangle her. The physical act was brutal, but the psychological meaning is even more difficult to process. At some point during that encounter, the relationship between mother and daughter ceased to protect Carissa. Whatever trust existed was met with violence. Whatever expectation Carissa had that her mother would keep her safe was shattered. And after Carissa stopped breathing, Penny was left with the consequences of her decision. There was a body. There was evidence. There was a family. There was a community. And there was a story that had to be invented. The next stage was concealment. The body could not simply remain where it was. The disappearance had to appear plausible. The investigation had to move in another direction. That is where the later condition of the scene becomes significant. When Carissa's body was eventually discovered, her jeans and underwear had been pulled down. The arrangement could create the impression that she had been sexually assaulted, but investigators did not find evidence supporting sexual assault. That discrepancy would become important, because if the appearance of the scene did not match the forensic evidence, then someone may have created that appearance intentionally. And if someone staged the scene, the question becomes, what did they want investigators to believe? Perhaps they wanted police to search for an unknown sexual predator. Perhaps they wanted the crime to look random. Perhaps they wanted attention directed away from the family. Perhaps the purpose was simply to create confusion. Whatever the intention, the effect was the same. The scene did not immediately tell the truth. It told a story, and investigators had to determine whether that story was genuine. This is one of the most fascinating aspects of criminal investigation. A crime scene can be both evidence and deception. Objects can be moved. Clothing can be rearranged. Bodies can be placed. A location can be selected because of what it suggests. But forensic examination can reveal when appearance and reality do not agree. The body tells one story, the staging tells another, and the contradiction becomes a clue. For Carissa's family, however, the discovery of her body meant something much more immediate. The uncertainty was over. The hope was over. The search was over. A missing child had become a dead child. There is a brutal finality in that transition. Before a body is found, the mind can protect itself with possibilities. Maybe she is alive. Maybe she will come back. Maybe someone has found her. Maybe the next phone call will bring good news. After the body is found, those possibilities disappear. The family has to confront the fact that the child they were trying to find has already been lost. For the community, the emotional transformation would have been equally severe. People who had searched for Carissa were now confronted with the reality that their search had been a search for a victim. The photographs that once represented hope now represented someone who was gone. The landscape that people had searched became connected with death, and the investigation became more urgent because someone had killed Carissa, and that person was still out there. At this point, the possibility of a stranger would naturally attract attention. A 12-year-old child had been killed. The scene appeared to suggest sexual violence. It was reasonable to consider an unknown offender. But investigators also had to examine the people closest to Carissa. The closer the relationship, the greater the access. The greater the access, the greater the opportunity. And Penny had both. She knew Carissa. She had access to her. She had been with her. She knew her routines. She knew where they had gone. She knew what happened during the final journey. And she was the person who had initially reported the disappearance. None of those facts alone prove murder. Together, however, they create a reason to look carefully. That is what investigators did. The circle began tightening. Vernon McCumber became relevant because of his relationship with Penny. If Penny's motive involved preserving that relationship, investigators had to determine whether Vernon was connected to the crime. That meant questioning him, examining his movements, considering whether he had knowledge of the killing. It also meant confronting a difficult possibility. Could Penny have acted alone? The answer would eventually be yes, but investigators needed evidence to establish it. The eventual undercover operation would become critical. Macomber was in custody, and an undercover officer approached him while presenting himself as someone connected to a criminal organization. The scenario was designed around a very particular psychological pressure, the idea that evidence could be made to disappear, that someone might be able to help, that there might be a way out. The undercover strategy would eventually create a pathway back to Penny, and once Penny believed she was dealing with someone who could protect her, she began revealing information. This is where the investigation became less about what Penny claimed publicly and more about what she believed she could safely say privately. That distinction is crucial. Public statements are often carefully controlled. A person knows they're being watched. They know their words may be recorded. They know other people are listening. But when someone believes they're speaking to a person who understands crime and can help conceal evidence, their psychological defenses can change. They may speak differently. They may reveal details. They may correct someone else's version of events. They may attempt to demonstrate knowledge. And sometimes, they say something only the offender could know. Penny's eventual recorded statements would become central to the case. But before the confession, there was a long period in which investigators had to keep working. The body had been found. The scene had raised questions. The family had become the focus. The motive was beginning to emerge, and the investigation was gradually turning inward. The road between Bridgewater and the isolated areas surrounding it had become more than a physical route. It was the path through which investigators could reconstruct the final chapter of Carissa's life. They could ask where she had been, where she had gone, where she had stopped, where she was found. And eventually, they could compare those answers against Penny's story. That process would reveal the central contradiction. Penny knew the truth. The public did not. The police did not initially know. The community did not. But evidence was closing the gap. Every discovery reduced the space in which the lie could survive. The more investigators learned, the fewer explanations remained. A random abduction became less satisfying. A sexual predator theory weakened when forensic evidence did not support sexual assault. The involvement of Vernon required investigation, but did not ultimately explain the evidence. And the mother's own behavior increasingly demanded scrutiny. This did not mean investigators could simply declare Penny guilty. They still needed proof. A suspicion is not a conviction. A motive is not proof. A strange behavior is not proof. A facial expression is not proof. Even an inconsistency is not proof by itself. The case had to be built carefully. That is what makes the eventual breakthrough so important. The investigators would not simply decide that Penny was guilty. They would create circumstances in which her own words could help demonstrate what she had done. The road to that moment began with the disappearance. Then came the search. Then the body. Then the questions. Then the family. Then the motive. And finally, the psychological pressure that would cause the story to crack. But underneath the investigation was always the same reality. Carissa was 12. She should have been going home. She should have been growing older. She should have been arguing with friends, making plans, learning, changing, discovering who she would become. Instead, her final journey ended with her body being hidden in the landscape. The town that once knew her only as a child would soon know her as a victim. And the woman who should have been fighting hardest for her return would eventually be exposed as the person responsible for making that return impossible. The geography of the case, therefore, tells us something profound. Carissa's death did not happen in an abstract space. It happened within a world she knew. The roads were real. The distances were real. The people were real. The relationships were real. And the betrayal was real. The final journey began with a mother and daughter traveling together. It ended with a mother returning alone. And somewhere between those two moments was the answer investigators would spend the coming days trying to uncover. Why did Penny take Carissa there? What happened when they arrived? Why did Penny kill her? Why was the scene altered? Why did she report Carissa missing? Why did she allow others to search? Why did she continue the story? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, how could a mother look at her own daughter's absence and choose to protect the lie instead of telling the truth? The investigation would eventually provide answers, but before those answers came, the people of Bridgewater had to live with uncertainty. They had to look at the roads where Carissa might have traveled. They had to hear her name. They had to see her photograph. They had to wonder what kind of person could have done such a thing. And they had to confront the possibility that the person responsible might not be a stranger at all. The closer investigators looked, the smaller the world became. The unknown predator began to disappear from the center of the story. The family moved closer. The relationship between Penny and Vernon became more important, and Penny herself became impossible to ignore. The mother who had first appeared to be the person most desperate to find Carissa was now becoming the person investigators most needed to understand. The road had brought Carissa to her final destination. Now the investigation would follow that same road backward, from the body, to the location, to the vehicle, to the journey, to the mother, and eventually to the truth. But the truth was not going to emerge easily. Penny had already demonstrated that she was willing to lie. She had already allowed a false disappearance story to take root. She had already watched other people search for a child she knew was dead. If investigators wanted the truth, they would need more than questions. They would need to make Penny believe that telling the truth could benefit her. And that was exactly where the investigation was heading. The next stage would no longer be about the landscape. It would be about psychology, about manipulation, about trust, and about the moment when the person who had spent weeks controlling the story would finally find herself inside a situation she did not control. The investigation was closing in, and Penny had no idea how close it was.